everyone. I'm Scott King, and thanks for joining this episode of the Union Podcast. I'm joined by my co-host, Chris Kraus. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Scott.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
All right. And then we also have John Michelson, Chief Geek at Krista Software. Hey, John.
How you doing, guys?
We're doing great. Hey, we are going to follow up on our last episode where we talk about 3 different use cases for document understanding, answering questions from users, whether employees or customers. We talked about 3 different use cases where there's like an unknown question. So I think this is the typical, chatbot type use case that people think about. Like, I need to figure out like where all my documents are, so when people have a question, they can find an answer, right? So you don't know what the question is. You would have to foresee all the questions if you were going to code this into some type of chatbot. And then we talked about the known questions, right? So these are questions that you probably send out to people, and then you get lots of different answers. How do you manipulate that? Then we talked about, how would you enable just, natural language processing across your organization to find information and to run processes, right? I need to do this, I need to do that. So we want to go into the unknown questions in much greater detail. Some people call this like enterprise search. Like I want all of my information available in some format, right? So people are trying to figure it out because they have this ChatGPT experience and they can experiment, with internet content, but they want their own content, manuals, sales systems, CRM, ERP, what have you. So Chris, if people want to do this, right? Everyone that has been on the internet in the past year and a half has played with Gemini, ChatGPT, right? There's a huge buzz around all these AI agents. Like, really, what is kind of an overview, and so to help us dive into the details that we're going to talk to John with.
Yeah. So the thing that people like is it has answers, right? That's the one thing they're like, oh, I can ask it anything, and give me an answer. Now, there may be hallucinations, it may not be the right answer, or it may be a very general response. And so when we actually talk in the enterprise level, my customers, I say I've got one of 2 problems. I've done my homework. I've put all my documents into something. A lot of times it's SharePoint or it's OneDrive or it's Box. I've curated them and I've got some draconian change management process around it, and people still can't find things because they have answers, but they can't find them in these documents. So I put them there, I still can't search them. And so that's great. That makes it easy for Krista to be the model employee to read those, and then she will then answer questions based on them. And then the other half of my customers, they're like, I've got so much tribal knowledge. It's all in people's heads. And these people are going to retire, and I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't ask them to sit and write everything down because they won't know what it is. They know so much, they would spend the next 6 years writing it down. So really, when you talk about Q&A and answering questions, it's a great use case because that's where you want to have automation to say, if you don't have the answer documented, have it actually fall back and ask a subject matter expert to give you the answer, and that builds the documentation library in the background. So you can get to a point of software helping you, but there's not a gate of you have to have all the answers or not. In this use case, literally, we don't know what all the questions are, so we don't know all the answers, but there's a path forward for each person to get value very quickly. And one thing I've noticed when people are thinking about this, they're thinking very myopic. Well, if I'm on my desktop, I, as a single person, can take an HR policy and cut and paste it into ChatGPT and ask it a question. Or I can take the notes from 3 meetings, I paste it into GPT, and then it gives me an answer. So everything people are talking about is I do work, I find things, and then I want it to do the summarization or actually fix, in my case, all my spelling and grammatical errors, right? So with John, it's that's probably not the best way to do this because you're forcing the person to be the integration glue for everything. And when you do that, there's no way to control security. There's no way to handle hallucinations because you're commingling data from what Gemini or ChatGPT knows versus what you know. And then sometimes you need access to different data sources. So how have we actually solved that at Krista? Because we've done a bunch of cool things and people don't realize that there's some problems you have to overcome.
Yeah, well, you named a bunch of them. The fundamental issue is that no one has perfect, clean data that's properly attributed to role and to even characteristics like region or time frame and things like that. And there's open holes there that have to get filled in, and then there's inconsistency in certain information, and all of those things have to be dealt with. And I'm sure that a lot of folks who are watching this would be thinking, man, I'd love to be able to just kind of wiggle my nose and everything that we have be in one repository and it be good and clean, and I can just have people asking it instead of me, or exposing significant amounts of our content in that way. And actually you can, is a long story short, despite the fact that it has those holes and those gaps and things, because essentially really good orchestration of people into the process of curating that content gets you there. So when an answer is not sufficiently supported in the content that's been provided, it's going to invoke a person in the appropriate role. We're going to get that. Well, maybe you're going to go dig up a document on that, or maybe you're going to go prose mode right there, and you're going to type out a really good answer, and you're going to be just fine. And that is going to help in a lot of those ways. Now, you mentioned enterprise search, Scott, at the top. Enterprise search typically is architected to replicate the data out of existing systems and even the file systems out of all of those into another thing where it's easier for that system, that enterprise search system, to index it and do stuff like that. And then you basically query that new data representation of all of that stuff. We just fundamentally think that you're never going to get there if you're trying to replicate all of that. And there's always going to be much bigger than gaps. You're going to get nothing there. And there's not much in the way of workflow to keep the curation aspect going there. It's all just really about dumping data into a lake. And we've heard lots of good synonyms for data lake. Instead, it's the data dump, and it's all of that stuff. I mean, there's lots of people who've become quite enamored with describing just how terrible their data lakes are, because it's a natural, you'd expect it given what is actually being done, right? So this idea of what is in static form already in file systems, we want to ingest that directly, but what is in systems is actually very carefully, in most cases, very carefully database architected to be correctly structured, right? So you want to actually leave it there and ask it real time. You don't want to try to replicate it into something else and then, essentially lose the schema and then try to apply a schema to it when you make a question. You want to leave those things in place. And they change so often that you'd never be up to date. If I said right now, what's my sales manager in the West Coast's forecast for the quarter? It probably changed since this morning. So we don't have the replicate the content into another system, get it indexed, get it available, and then oh my gosh, now all the data is in one place, so we're going to re-implement a whole bunch of role-based access controls. I think that's a losing proposition for most. And that when you have, again, this really intelligent orchestration of, is that question better served from the static content I have, or marrying that potentially with access to live systems that I can query, including the awareness of the fact that, oh, that's John, he can or cannot access that system with that particular query. That, I think, where we've really moved the ball forward. And one more really quick thing. It's interesting because Chris gave you a couple of examples of how, working with customers, we've identified where these challenges are and how we've been pretty good at overcoming them. There are so many more, and I won't give you an exhaustive list, but one of my personal favorites recently, authoritative content versus lack of authoritative content. So there's a big difference between content that is essentially, we're not sure where we got this, we don't know who wrote this, we don't know when it was written, but let's use it for an answer to a question to a customer. What do you think? Versus this is actual product specification with a date and the right model number, versus this is a third party certifying to the fact that the following things are true of this particular product, right? Those are three different levels of authority. And for what one of the things that I'm really proud of, I guess, not a lot of people talk about it inside, because I guess it's maybe a little minor, but if you think about we've gone this far, surely your challenge has been covered, right? But when we ingest content, we establish that authority as moderate, of course, low or high. And then that goes into the transparency around when Krista generates answers that allows us to give you the ability to make decisions about whether that's a decision or information that you think you should be using to make a decision or to provide to an end customer or whatever, right? Because you have that ability to look at the confidence and the authority score, the trust score, all these things and say, I think that's not sufficient, or I think we're going to call that a Mr. Customer. I think I need to get back to you on that one because all I got's basically crummy content. I'm not even sure where it came from. So things like that are what really, I think, set apart the notion of where we were trying to get with enterprise search. But what we wound up doing is creating another whole massive IT infrastructure and a whole group of people trying to figure out how to now perform queries in, we're trying to force business people to learn SQL. Now we're trying to make them learn non-SQL. and there you go. So, back to you guys for more on this if you want, but we're not really moving the ball forward all that much if you just turn them into all prompt engineers either. But at least we're trying to get closer to natural language. Yeah.
So John, can you talk a little about the differences between, say, efficacy of a document? Like this is the return policy for 2022. This is the corporate return policy for 2021 versus real-time data. So I don't think people actually realize those are different things. Some things you want efficacy for historical purposes. Mm-hmm. And then other things, like you said, the sales numbers, when they change, the history's gone. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Between efficacy and real time.
And I like that question, Chris, because when John was talking about data lakes, it just made me think about all the different like executive dashboards that take so much work. The data is replicated, and by the time you present it, it's like weeks old. So I'm really interested in the efficacy dates, John.
Well, it's funny because every one of the larger organizations that we've worked with, when they talk about their data lake, they talk about how it's not even how long it takes to get data out. It's how many years on the roadmap their project is getting in to the data lake to begin with. So anyway, you wouldn't create a spreadsheet of every possible time anybody's going to ask questions about the current forecast or an inventory level or whatever of anything that's dynamic, because you'd be generating spreadsheets thousands of times a day, putting them in, and what would you do? It's obviously moronic to begin with. So every piece of content, even if it's a file sitting on a disk drive, has a useful life. There's a certain period of time. There's a certain date at which it became relevant, and there's a certain date at which it becomes irrelevant, and relevant only from a historical perspective, but from a current, as of today, ask a question, it's relevant to the answer. It times out, if you will. The most obvious is last year's tax code, right? Last year's tax code is not the one you get to use to decide how you're paying your taxes. Yes, it's almost October. And yes, I'm the guy that always files just in time after the automatic postponement. So, of course, I get to think about taxes. But the point is, you can't use next year's, nor could you use last year's tax information. You got to use this year's. And that's the date effectivity aspect of content. And you need to be able to have both, because you're certainly going to have the guy who's working on, well, I said this year's taxes, but didn't I speak out incorrectly? It is actually last year's taxes, isn't it? And this actually makes the point even better, because here I am thinking I need this year's tax information, but no, I'm filing on last year. So I need to be able to ask a question about the tax rates as of this year for my estimated payments, and I've got to be able to produce a tax return that has to do with last year's tax information. And that is a very good example of the effectivity notion of dates. And even in static content where, say, contracts, law, regulation, et cetera, have dates in them that say, I become effective on this date, or I supersede another document as of a certain date, or what I say, only the parts that I have are superseded, and that document is true in every other way, unless I argue with it, right? So it's the amendment, the classic amendment kind of use case. All of those things should be taken into account. If you're going to get a rich system that can actually do the work that your people are currently doing most of their time with, the rough equivalent of an easy Google search is not what these systems need to be capable of doing in order for them to make their ROI, because you pretty much have Spotlight or search inside of SharePoint, or you just, or if it's already publicly available content, you just Google it, right? These systems have to have those capabilities in order to unlock what is going to turn into an effective movement of the ball forward, if you will. So all of that is in the static content world. But as I started with, basis of your question, Scott, you'd never produce the spreadsheet of the current inventory level of products that are constantly coming and going from the shelves, right? Because the numbers are always pointless once you bothered to get them out of the printer, if you will. You always want to access that real time. That's the point. When your, we'll say, content management solution, if you're using Krista as an AI content manager, what our ability to do is to understand the content by subject matter and such of what we know from static content, and we navigate all that authority, effectivity dating, all that cool stuff, roles, attributes, all of that good stuff, and know what systems have the real-time data that we would need in order to go and get that for you. We're able to combine both of those types of content into what is, one really cool answer to what is otherwise a really tough question to ask otherwise.
Yeah. Asking good questions, is important. And, even when you were talking about like a Google search and effectivity date, Google has a drop down, like how far back do you want me to search? Is this last week, last month, last year, right? So even that effectivity date is manual, right? So everyone should understand it, but you should be able to automate that with your prompt, right? Or just how you're asking a question. But
that's right.
Like retrieving all this. So I think the hard part with the unknown questions, we're calling this use case, is people, they understand how the answer is generated, but they don't really understand how like the LLMs are prompted, right? So that's why they say, I need to train my own LLM and stuff. And then the market popularized retrieval augmented generation, which is, based on your question, where do you go get the information, and then how do you actually generate the answer? It's a lot more complicated than people think. And you guys talk to customers on, the problems that they run into, with training, with hallucinations, with security. Talk to us a little bit about the RAG aspect of it, and basically how it needs to be done the first time versus, assuming too many unknowns and then finding that you just have a project that is out of control.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we've seen way too many customers that end up using Krista that started with, well, hey, LangChain's free and I can hack away at some Python and we could get this thing rolling and we'll see what we can do. And you end up with essentially a surrogate for a Google search capability, not a whole lot better. In fact, maybe you've got your own proprietary content, but otherwise certainly no better. I really should say. And as soon as you bump into any of the stuff we've just been talking about, you end up with quite a heavy lift. And even the effort of getting a completed solution, it's still a full-on application development lifecycle. You're about to start a backlog in Jira or version 1 or whatever. You're about to start hiring and planning and sprint meetings, and I'll put it on the backlog, and there you go, right? It's it's what's unfortunate is it conceptually should seem like when you go to an OpenAI, and I had a customer do this months ago, right in a meeting with essentially the same exact experience that Chris, you were describing a minute ago, where, wait, I can give a document to an LLM, I can ask it a question, it'll give me an answer. Case closed, right? No, you got gigabytes of content, terabytes of content. Half that content or more should not even be considered in this particular question. And if it is, your answer is going to be maybe wrong or worse. Wrong, right? Whoops. I shouldn't have said wrong or worse and right all in the same word.
Yeah, I wanted to double click on that because I don't know what that means at all.
Right. I don't know that it, yeah. I was prompted with too much information.
Yeah. That's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bad prompt.
But even the notion of prompts themselves. So we're making another one of those like simplifying assumptions from an IT or technology perspective and just sort of sticking the problem on the people who we're supposed to serve. Hey, you guys can learn SQL, right? Hey, you guys can learn NoSQL, right? Hey, you guys can learn prompt engineering, right? Well, it just gets more and more kind of out there. And it really is. Now, by the way, Krista engineers the prompts for you, right? That's the point we're actually heading at. But even with that, this notion that Scott mentioned a few minutes ago of asking good questions, we can't escape that. So if you ask a vague question, you get a vague answer. If you ask a specific question, you get a specific answer, or you get, I don't know that. That's incredibly valuable, by the way. Getting told I don't know that versus, well, it might be this or it might be this. The funny thing about most of the public-facing LLMs is the less likely, the longer the answer, the less likely you're actually getting what you're looking for. Because you probably didn't ask it for a polemic on a interesting topic. You probably asked it to answer a somewhat more precise question. And if you are asking it for a polemic on a topic, then you've got a lot of time on your hands, because I don't know that that's really what those things are particularly helpful for. So we have to think about making sure that people ask good questions, but we certainly don't want them in the realm of actually engineering prompts. The one weird thing that just literally this morning, of course, every day there's a lot of buzz around what's going on in AI in general, and certainly with the large language models. The sensationalized quote basically is, Claude just eliminated the whole need for RAG because its context window, or its memory, the size of its brain, is so big. You can just shove everything in it, and it's got this notion of a cache now, and you don't need to deal with all of these specifics. But essentially, this argument is you can shove so much content into it, and it doesn't cost all that much to use that content to access it again and again and again once you shove it in. So you don't need to go through all of that process. Well, guys, that's completely insane. There's no topical, subject matter based, role based, time sensitive, authority oriented, lexically oriented, shape of content aware. You just basically missed everything that makes this thing interesting. And like I said, the very simplest use case, you could actually do what this guy was saying. You could just shove a bunch of content into Claude. You could cache it into Claude, which means that it's kind of going to keep it there for you for a while, so you can ask questions of it again and again, like a longer conversation, and it's there for you. And yeah, it's going to generate 3 paragraphs every time you ask it something, and you're going to call that success. And then you realize that you can't actually, that doesn't reduce a single phone call to your customer success people. It doesn't increase any of the sales reps' proficiency with the products they're selling. It's not going to, whatever it was you were trying to do, right? Because in fact, it takes all those other things to get you there. And after a few months, you'll be looking for something more sophisticated. But that's where this whole notion of I've got the content, but I don't know the questions that'll be asked. Those are the big challenges, because since you don't know what the questions are, you just go looking for content. And as soon as you do, you're now dealing with, well, different content has different shapes. It has only appropriate in certain subject matters, only to certain people, only for certain periods of time. Who's asking the question? Because I'm only going to use high authoritative content if it's executives. And I'm going to say, well, it might be this if it's to our rank and file folks who might actually be perfect to follow up with and validate if that's content, that sort of thing, right? So you really can get where you're trying to go, all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. If you start down the path realizing that this is where you're headed, right? So start with the end in mind. Where am I really trying to get to? It's a pretty sophisticated place. It's actually it's a pretty cool place. We just announced, we had a company meeting just a little while ago, right? We had to announce bunch of new customers that have launched just in the last 7 days, and one of them is that classic. We brought them up in 4 weeks. They're deployed, and they're running now, and they basically kind of transformed their organization by getting all of that information out. Solved an executive problem with too much data locked in tribal knowledge, right? Locked in brains as tribal knowledge. And pressure on executives to always be getting asked the question. It's really powerful. If you start with that end in mind and then you back into, okay, now what would I do in the next month?
Yep.
It wouldn't be down the line.
Yeah, John, one thing I don't think people really understand is you have to apply automation to get the context to the user to actually get the right answer. Yeah, Claude can have the entire company's roster in it, but that doesn't mean it's going to reasoning to understand these are your employees and these are your employees in the US versus the UK. That whole concept of some things you're going to get context of a user from, say, a system, API it, and then apply that to the way you're searching. Can you explain how that works? Because I think people don't realize that it can be that sophisticated, but it's not difficult if your platform does it for you.
Right. And Chris, of course, no surprise, given that you are such a big part of making this thing and making sure that customers get a chance to use it effectively. It's one of those main components, right? We talk about this all the time, but just to be super fast, maybe 30% of what your people are actually going to do with a system like this is a surrogate for a Google search where they don't need to have context. They're not looking for, they just need an answer. It's, what is Chris Krause's birthday? If that's in the content, hopefully it's accurate enough. By the way, many times it's actually going to have a hard time without doing a lexical analysis. It's going to have a hard time actually, depending on how you ask the question. But let's just assume it's going to work and you're going to get your answer. That's great. Didn't require any assuming that birth dates are not sensitive information and you were allowed access to it. Let's just make that assumption. But fully the other 70% falls into these other pie slices. And you just hit on one that is so important. So if I ask, here I am sitting in Dallas, Texas, if I ask the same question that someone in same company, even in the same role, in a different part of the country or a different country, asks the exact same word for word question, needs to get entirely different answer, right? It's not even about security authorization. It's just about when I ask that question, my scope context is intentionally, well, let's say central region if I'm a sales manager, right? What are my most important, who are my biggest customers? That is, the my is implying a lot. And that requires the orchestration of systems to collect context in real time, potentially the orchestration of systems to get that answer even in real time. But possibly you've got a most valuable customer list somewhere, and it's able to automatically pull the ones out that happen to be in central region, and I'm going to get my correct answer, and my colleagues in other parts of the world will get theirs. But without context, which is typically who am I talking to, you won't get there. The other part of it becomes
the most important customer list is in a spreadsheet on the chief revenue officer's laptop. That's where that is.
That is right.
All right. So John, we've talked about some of these use cases for these unknown questions, right? We talked about the tribal knowledge. That one's dear to me because I try to write everything down and supply it to everybody because I don't want to know something that, somebody can't access. And then customer support and sales, like that is, from an internal perspective, that is a good use case because like there's just the situations change so often, like who the customer is, employee churn, like no, we have to get outside of the tribal knowledge. Like we can't ask Brent from the Phoenix Project all of the IT questions, right? Just because he knows everything.
Yeah.
And then, standard operating procedures, like things that don't come up often. Like how do I do this, right? So
That's right.
if I have some of those use cases and I want to, I want to bite off on one, right? I'm a executive leading some function, right? And we're like, hey, we have to solve this problem. What are some concrete action items that someone like that can take to get started, whether it's with Krista or not? Like, what are some like 3 or 4 concrete things that they can do?
Well, they've got to start identifying audience, content, and the business case around why this needs to be solved. Because annoying things we'll always have. Things that are dollars and cents or revenue generating to deal with is beyond annoying. That's something the business should be investing in doing something about, right? We pay you to deal with annoying things, but so that's not a sufficient business case. What is a sufficient business case is when I'm reducing cost, I'm increasing revenue, or there are less tangible but incredibly valuable things like I'm going to affect morale and therefore turnover, and I'm just going to make myself a better work environment and attract better employees, and all of the good things about being good people by improving quality of life and in using this for HR or in doing this for the regulatory body of content that is overloading everyone. How would anyone know how they're supposed to do anything that there isn't already tons of government regulation around? And it's specific to the use case and the industry and the location frequently. And there may be even be down to county, even down to city. If you're if one of the larger cities in the U.S., where how am I supposed to do something, or what's the rule about that? You'd almost have to ask that question before you do anything, right? Oh, I'm about to sneeze. What Kleenex box do I grab? I'm being annoying, but the idea of making sure that burden is off your people accelerates them. Things go faster. Revenue comes in faster. Costs go down. People are happier. Less churn. I mean, it's just magic, right? So alleviating that, you asked where to start. What are the concrete steps? Though I gave you the concrete stuff, and then I give you the motivation to take those steps, right? Because that's really where it's at. And when we launched one of those customers we just this morning, our customer success lead who brought him up, you could tell he was incredibly proud. He said, "Look, that's a different company. They're so excited about where this is taking them. An AI journey that starts with something they were able to conceive and deliver within a month, and that they went to the board and showed a demo, and the board members are using it and then patting them on the back and saying, this is what we need to see from you guys. This is how you become a category leader." And there's your motivation. But the steps are pretty easy. Identify the audience and the gap in knowledge. If we're talking purely about this notion of, I have content, but I don't know the questions I'm going to be asked, so I don't know how to make sure that I get the right answers to the right people. You got to start with what audience, what is that body of content, and who are the critical people who will solve your content gaps and your inconsistencies, right? Because that's it. Those are important things. And then you can, hire a team of developers, or you can talk to Krista people.
Oh, perfect. So speaking of someone that can close the knowledge gap, Chris, anything else on the action items that John didn't cover?
So I just want to go back to that first thing I said, that people may think, okay, I don't have all my documents, therefore I can't start. But really, we're finding both use cases are equally as successful, and we're 50-50 split. Some people say we created a content warehouse, all this stuff is there, people just don't know how to find it. The other is we've got all tribal knowledge. We're especially small companies, right? Like, these are the 3 people, each one is a subject matter expert in one area. If they ever leave, we're hosed, but we can't just extract their brains, although we don't have that yet. Maybe Star Trek we will, but we can Vulcan mind meld, we can't do that yet. So how do we actually get them to proactively get prompted to answer questions we don't have the content for, and then automatically fill the backlog of the content? Then that solves for it, because then it's like they may know 400 things, but these are the 100 that people need to know because people ask those questions. So I think that it's important to realize both paths are that 4-week to success. When we say 4 weeks, it's not that you already have the content. It could be either path.
Yeah, and I think what people don't realize is that, obviously you have to put your content together and get it into some type of system, but we're automating that, right? It's not a manual exercise a lot of times. If you have completely dirty data, yeah, maybe you need to manipulate it a little bit, but just using machine learning to build machine learning so this thing works is a huge step. So, if you find yourself, you want to solve something and you don't know how to get your data into a system, obviously contact us and we'll help you. But, so thanks guys. We covered, a lot of requirements when trying to do something seemingly simple, right? From the security and the context. We covered this unknown questions. Next time in our document understanding series, we're going to cover known questions. So these are questions you would ask of somebody else. And then we'll go down into like how you structure the documents, how you look at that, how you run your process, and then basically how you're creating hours of capacity by using automation. So really appreciate you guys hanging in there with me on this series, and until next time.